iPhone 14 Pro Max versus iPhone 13 Pro Max after 1 year. Now, this is a comparison between my thoughts on both of these phones after having the 14 Pro Max as an upgrade for 1 year. I want to give you kind of my thoughts on the 13 Pro Max now. We're around 2 years later with this phone, and I've had both of them. And let's begin by talking about the build, the body, the price here. So the pricing was basically the same on both phones, so I didn't pay really any more to get the iPhone 14 Pro Max over the iPhone 13 Pro Max when it launched. But as a phone that's pretty similar, if it wasn't for making YouTube videos and covering the latest and greatest for you guys, I probably as a user would have skipped out on this one unless I just had an itch to have the latest and greatest phone, because it was pretty similar with some nice upgrades with the dynamic island and, you know, having a brighter screen and a little bit better camera, but it wasn't like a major leap forward for the experience. Now, when talking about the build and the body, the only really thing I noticed was the different color. I got the space black. You'll see right here I have the space gray or the graphite color option here for the iPhone 13 Pro Max. And I also noticed that the 14 Pro Max weighed a little more, probably mostly due to them cameras being thicker. But if you take a look, you'll notice the cameras were definitely thicker. But after 1 year, I gotta say, when it comes to the build and the body, it was not any better or worse. Well, maybe slightly heavier, but it was not really different at all. You know, holding this phone, I felt like I was in the same experience as I was the previous year when I was rocking the 13 Pro Max. It was like the same thing. Didn't even feel like anything changed really besides the novelty of the dynamic island, which wore off pretty quick, but the notch was still there. Overall, I felt like I was using the same product all of this year since the iPhone 14 Pro Max did come out. Now, that's not a bad thing because the iPhone 14 Pro Max and the iPhone 13 Pro Max do have around the same build quality with the stainless steel. They've been fantastic phones in terms of durability and basically similar. So if you're looking for an iPhone at a cheaper price point, a large iPhone, wait till the iPhone 15 Pro Max comes out and take a look at this 13 Pro Max. It's still going to have that nice build quality, the matte textured back glass. Of course, a newer phone's probably going to be the better option, but this is still going to be a better option than something like an iPhone 14 Plus for some people. And it's going to give you a nice premium phone at a nice secondhand price that's going to give you quite a bit for the money now that you waited not to get it brand new, as it's depreciated. You'll also see that this stainless steel, while it can show scratches if you don't take care of the phone, it definitely is very durable. So if you drop it, it's not very easy to break an iPhone 13 Pro Max. So 2 years later, very, very happy with it, how the build's held up. Again, you can get little scuffs and nicks on it like I got right there. And sometimes if you're jamming your lightning cable in there, you can definitely get that like I did over here on the space black edition of the iPhone 14 Pro Max. It got a little bit scratched up in there. Other than that, little minor stuff, you know, both these phones are some of the most rock solid, durable flagships on the market today with IP68 dust and water resistance. There's even videos on YouTube where like these phones have been submersed in like lakes and ponds and people have found them. I'm not sure if it's these specific ones, but certain iPhones, and people have found them and they've actually restored them and they still work. It's kind of crazy. Now, bringing it on over here to display, both of these did get the ProMotion Super Retina XDR panel. And I found that they were basically the same exact experience, besides the fact that I do feel like the dynamic island was more of a distraction in terms of, I just looked at it more than the notch. The notch, they're both notches at the end of the day, but the notch over here kind of faded into the bezels a little bit more to me, whereas a dynamic island, because I could see some screen up here, I don't know, I just kept looking at it. And even to this day, I still look at the dynamic island. And I know it can sound like, that's petty, who cares? Nobody cares about that stuff. Listen, you know, people who want to see an all-screen iPhone right here, I've been wanting to see an all-screen iPhone forever. I mean, a truly all-screen, nothing interrupting the screen experience. I definitely notice it. But in terms of the speed of refresh, it's essentially the same on both phones. You can see that the iPhone 13 Pro Max is a little bit slower here 2 years later than the iPhone 14 Pro Max. And we're going to see a faster chip in the upcoming 15 Pro Max. But in terms of brightness, they were pretty close. I would say that the 14 Pro Max was brighter for sure. It was actually so bright I have to reduce white point at nighttime. It gets too bright. But it actually dimmed more. I think because it's way brighter than the iPhone 13 Pro Max. It was kind of rare. Like once in a while, the 13 Pro Max would dim if it was too bright. This phone though, the 14 Pro Max, a lot of times all it has to do is get a little bit warm out in the heat, and this phone dims very easily. In terms of the text sharpness though, we have essentially the same level of sharpness here on the text. It's not really any difference in the pixels per inch. Nothing like that. They both have True Tone, Night Shift, Dark Mode. And 2 years later, there's no upgrading experience here on display besides the little bit of extra brightness and the dynamic island, which adds to notifications and pop-ups on your display through that pill up there. When it comes to software, both of them did get the iOS 16.6 update that was recent, and we're already on multiple betas of 17. That's going to be coming next month, so we're not too far away from the official launch of iOS 17, but the iPhone 13 Pro Max still performing just about as well as it did day one. So if you plan to keep this phone for the next 3 years, I wouldn't blame you. This phone is definitely going to be able to handle all the software coming from Apple for quite some time. And all year, I haven't really had major performance issues at all with the 13 Pro Max. Now, the 14 Pro Max had a couple of bugs, a little bit more bugs actually I experienced on this phone than the 13 Pro Max, but it got worked out, and now it's basically just as good of a performer as the iPhone 13 Pro Max. But software-wise, it's the same experience. You have the same app library, the same, everything is the same. It's like using the same exact phone with a different portion up here. So really absolutely no difference beside what you're going to find in the camera, which is going to be the action mode and stuff like that. Now, iOS to me is still very polished. It's very simple, very smooth. So I still do really enjoy the software, and I think it's all about the apps and what you do with the phones rather than, the customization all the time. The customization is great if you get bored and you want to play around with your pocket computer and your smartphone, but when it comes to the pure app experience, I still like what iOS offers. They just got really quality applications that look smooth. Animations are butter. It's a really good experience here on both products. Performance-wise, Geekbench 6 would prove, if we did a test right here, that the iPhone 13 Pro Max is behind. You could see that it's clocked a little bit lower at 3.23 gigahertz, but at the same time, in the real world, like I just said in my previous section of this video, you don't really do a lot of customization. There's not a lot of split screen. There's nothing like that. iOS doesn't really take too much advantage of that power, not in the areas of everyday regular use. There's some AR stuff and things like that, definitely that do take advantage of the CPU. Maybe when you're really diving into a game like Call of Duty, Asphalt 9, where you actually will get a little bump in performance, maybe a little bit warmer over heavier use on the iPhone 13 Pro Max. But in reality, most people are just day-to-day never going to see or ever take advantage of the power upgrade that comes with the Apple A16 over this Apple A15 because it's not big at all. We'll have to see if the 3nm A17 will take it to the next level. And if you'll even notice it then, we'll have to see in our upcoming speed test next month. So 2 years later with the cameras, I still actually prefer the iPhone 13 Pro Max's cameras for just regular use. I think they're a little bit better in terms of the focusing time or the distance or whatever. It's just better for the regular consumer. I do feel like, the iPhone 14 Pro Max is a great upgrade for those of you who really go deeper into the camera with the RAW. I mean, we have RAW on the 13 Pro Max as well, but the video, you have the action mode for more steady performance. The 48 megapixel RAW photos are going to be a little bit better for editing. And if you're really into camera, I do think the iPhone 14 Pro Max clearly is the better camera option here. But I don't really think the average consumer of this phone would ever, again, really dive deep into it. And if you're the type of person who's using it for, video creation and stuff like that, well, then you're not the average consumer, because average consumers buy these phones and they just take a picture. Like, even though they have all these features, I still see people with iPhone Pros and these really high-end camera phones, and they're just not even opening stuff up. It's just on the 1X, and they just take a picture. Like it's like they don't even use the stuff. So it's there, but at the same time, I do think that if you want the better camera, I found better results 2 years later, of course, with the iPhone 14 Pro Max, but it was a little bit more tricky to get those great results. Like, not in the sense of like it can't take a photo. It's very snappy with that. What I'm saying is that the focusing distance sometimes would be a little bit harder if you don't know how to like focus this. Sometimes, like right there, look at this, watch this. So you could see there's a little blur right there because it's not the right distance. Now let's check it out over here on the iPhone 13 Pro Max. About the same distance there, and take a look at this. You see what I'm talking about? So they have different focusing distance, and I think this can throw off some iPhone users that really, just like to point and shoot. So the 13 Pro Max, the better point and shoot camera over the year. I've used both of these and kind of like been analyzing them. The 14 Pro Max, the better pro camera if you know what you're doing. Definitely, but both of them are very great cameras, of course. And then you have the front-facing shooters, which are also basically the exact same type of 12 megapixel cameras. Both of them can do really great video and really great selfies as well. On the topic of battery life, the iPhone 14 Pro Max was not everyone's favorite. For me, it gets through a full day quite easily. The iPhone 13 Pro Max was stretching it even further though, with the 14 Plus being the best iPhone battery I've seen, but not a very popular phone. 13 Pro Max was definitely better even up to this day over the 14 Pro Max. So we're going to see upgrades to battery. I'm pretty certain of it with the next version of the Max, but this one was a little bit better. This one pretty close, but not quite enough. I got about an hour more screen time with the iPhone 13 Pro Max, sometimes only 45 minutes, but that's more than, the iPhone 14 Pro Max. And I think it was attributed due to the higher brightness levels, mostly, with not a huge difference in battery size. I think it was actually slightly smaller on the 13 or on the 14 Pro Max. So not a huge difference in the battery size, but upping that brightness means that you're basically going to get a little bit worse battery life. And then the camera, 4K and stuff like that, those are really the drainers of battery, along with gaming as well. Now, in the area of phone call quality, I didn't see any improvements in my experience on the 14 Pro Max. It was basically the same here as well. I'll tell you, I think the audio was a little bit better on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. It could just be me, but 13 Pro Max was great as well. It just sounded a little bit crispier to me on the 14 Pro Max, but not by enough that any regular person is going to be able to tell. It was definitely very small, but because I test so many phones, I could definitely tell that the 14 Pro Max sounded a little bit better than the iPhone 13 Pro Max. Wrapping it up here, thicker camera bump, space black color option was pretty cool when it came out. Deep purple options as well. Silent switches, volume rocker, same location. Everything about these phones. And you could see why Apple doesn't really keep last year's version around, because it's the same thing. And then who would buy the new phone if they see that the same phone is out there on the shelf? You could see basically the same phone for a lesser price. They're not going to do that. 13 Pro Max is my favorite iPhone right now to recommend. In terms of if you can find it on a deal, it's just so good. Like really fast performance, really great camera setup. It's just as premium as like a 14 Pro Max. I just love recommending this phone. And even now, it might be a little bit not as cool to recommend when the 15 Pro Max comes out, because it's probably going to change the design game up. But if the prices come down on these, it's still going to be a great recommendation. So I love recommending the 13 Pro Max. It's just a winner. It still is. The 14 Pro Max is a winner too in terms of being a great phone, but it's not everyone's favorite because it's just like one of those years, like the iPhone 6 and the 6S, the iPhone 7 and the 8. It's just one of those years where the phone is just so similar. But other than that, if you do want to go to 14 Pro Max, I think you'll be very happy there as well. Both are great phones. But comparing them a year later, I didn't find the differences to be huge. If I was going to put the differences on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say the differences were about a 2 out of 10. So like 20% better on the 14 Pro Max. That was about it over all this time that I've had the 14 Pro Max in comparison to my 13 Pro Max. So thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and if you have any more questions, comments, concerns, or videos you want to see, drop them down below in the comments. I'll catch you on the next episode. Nick here. Be sure to be well, and peace.